Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Malcolm Gladwell. Got to sit down with Malcolm to discuss the latest season of his podcast, Revisionist History. That season is entitled The Alabama Murders. I think this is a story, as you'll hear me say in the interview, that everyone in the U.S. ought to listen very carefully to. Great conversation. I especially wanted to talk to Malcolm about storytelling and the morally formative nature of storytelling. Great conversation. Enjoy. Here's Malcolm Gladwell. Hey, friend, if you didn't know, I started a newsletter a while back that comes out every 2 weeks. I've been delighted to hear from so many of you about positive response to the newsletter. We call it the No Small Endeavor Notebook, where I riff on themes and topics related to our podcast, giving you additional material for thinking and doing in your own quest to make sense of what it might mean to live a good life. Join us by going now to nosmallendeavor.com and sign up there. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com to sign up now for our free No Small Endeavor Notebook newsletter. Welcome back, Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you. Delighted to be back.
Good to see you again. So, Alabama Murders, the new season of Revisionist History podcast. I have told a lot of friends that I think that every Alabamian should listen to that season of Revisionist History podcast. And then I go on to say, actually, I think every American ought to listen to Revisionist History podcast latest season. And I find it, very moving, and I find it very troubling and distressing. But thank you for it.
Oh, well, you were a big part of it. I told you, I think I emailed you and I said, I think I could have done, had I never met you, I think I could have done that story, but I don't think I could have done that story as well as I did.
Well,
I think that our friendship has shaped that story in all kinds of ways that I don't even know whether you realize.
Well, I'm honored by that. What I'd like to do today is talk about Alabama Murders, but I'd like to talk about it in terms of a discussion about storytelling and the art of moral formation. And and so let's begin just talking a little bit about this season. And I guess we need to do a spoiler alert so that if someone wants to listen to the season, maybe they should pause here and come back to this conversation. But
no, we won't. I think we can discuss it in a way that doesn't give. Because remember, the facts of the story are established very early on.
That's right.
Yeah.
But how would you give us a one paragraph description of the story that you're telling there?
It's just a story about a murder that happens in the Shoals, Florence, Alabama, that area of northwest Alabama in 1998. And
88, I think it is.
Yeah. 88, sorry. And two young men are alleged to have murdered the wife of a local Church of Christ minister. And they are convicted. They are sent to prison, and they are executed by the state of Alabama, the two of them. It's a very familiar, when I say familiar, it has happened many times in Alabama that people have been convicted and sentenced to death. So it tells a familiar story, but this story has many, many, many twists and turns. Among them that, although the murder takes place in 1988, the execution does not take place of the final, of the last of the two convicted murderers does not take place until 2 years ago. So the case consumes an enormous amount of time, and that's a crucial element in the telling of the story. Is this huge gap that exists between the act and its ultimate consequences?
You describe early on the notion of a cascade of failures, or a moral cascade of failures here. For those to whatever degree you want to, and give folks a little bit of a glimpse into what some of those levels of cascade of failures entail.
Mm-hmm. Well, the notion of a cascade is a term of art in the way people describe often disasters. If you think about, for example, 3 Mile Island, the famous sort of nuclear disaster in Pennsylvania, and God knows, I don't know when that was, 1980s, I think, or even 70s. If you analyze closely, it wasn't that something catastrophic happens. One catastrophic event happens and the whole nuclear plant goes into crisis. What you have instead is there was one small error made by somebody, which was then compounded by a second small error, which led to a third small error, and on and on and on. And a whole series of relatively trivial events culminate in a disaster. That's called a cascade. And it is often the case that when things go terribly wrong, they don't take the form of a single catastrophic event, but rather they take the form of a cascade. All of us have had mornings that cascade. You can't find your keys, and so you're late to take your kid to school, and so you speed, and so you get stopped by the police.
Yeah,
you're saying and before on and on and on and on. It just gets worse and worse and worse. That's a cascade. And my argument is that what happened to these two young men, John Forrest Parker and Kenny Smith, who were convicted of the murder of this woman in Alabama, was a cascade that it should have been resolved and ended very quickly, soon after the actual event. And it wasn't. We document at each level all of the kind of mistakes that lead to this thing getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we begin with the husband of the woman who was murdered, Church of Christ minister, who the murder he contracted with these two young men to kill his wife. And we start with this simple question of, why would he do that? What would drive a man, as opposed to, why didn't he just simply divorce his wife? Why didn't he, there are any number of ways which you can resolve a situation. Why would you be driven to go to the extraordinary step of finding two young men from the neighborhood to go and kill your wife, right? So we start with that. And then at each point along the way, there are these other cascading effects. The trial, the way in which these two young men were tried was a calamity. It's not even clear they did the thing they were accused of doing. And the evidence was all there, but somehow both the jury and even more so, the judge chose to disregard all of the reasonable doubt that existed over the actual crime. And then we build from there. There's 7 episodes, and we, in some sense, many of those episodes are about talking about the consequences of each step along that cascading catastrophe.
I remember standing in your kitchen one time. You were cooking dinner, and I asked you what you thought made for a good story. And you said something like, a good story betrays the expectations of its listeners.
Yeah.
Expound on that a little bit.
Well, we have, every time we are told a story, we have part of our impulse, very human impulse, is to try and predict the ending, right? And we do that because that's the way we make sense of the world, right? Human beings are prediction machines. That's how you navigate life. You're constantly extrapolating from what you see to a series of plausible scenarios about how they play out, right? That's how you walk down the street, right? You make predictions constantly about, is the person in front of me in my way or not? Is the car going to stop or not? Right? That's when I listen to someone talk, a huge part of comprehension is predicting what the person's going to say. I don't mean well in advance, but I mean like in the second before you finish your sentence, I'm thinking, oh, Lee's telling me he can't make lunch. So I'm, thinking, jumping ahead. And we do that as a function of as a fundamental part of our kind of cognitive functioning. And stories are powerful because they defy those predictions, right? That's why we're so drawn to them, because there's an enormous amount of pleasure, and more than pleasure, there's an enormous amount of meaning that comes from the story deviating and forcing us to think about an alternate version of the world. The resurrection is a story that defies its audience's expectations. It wasn't supposed to. He's dead, right? And then we discover he's not dead. And out of that, the germ of that realization comes an entire religion, right? It begins with a story that defies expectations. And so that a lot of what storytellers do is try and figure out, can I tell the story in some way that disrupts the listener's automatic filling in the blanks, right? You want to break that up, and that's what create that kind of tension between what you think is going to happen and what actually happens is what creates the power of a story.
So do you think that definition, a good story betrays expectations of its listeners, is that a fully sufficient definition of a good story? And I guess what I mean by that is that, I think you do that kind of storytelling really, really well, but it seems to me that you typically have a lot more going on in your storytelling than simply betraying the expectations of your listeners.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's sufficient. But I do think it's one of the core principles. And not every story can betray its expectations, the audience's expectations. So you can't do it all the time. I'm simply describing the feature, I think, of a class of uniquely powerful stories. That there is some moment of discovery, and what is discovery? Discovery is betrayal of expectation, right? It's like, I didn't expect to find this, and I did, and like, oh my goodness, right? Yeah. What does it mean? But that's, yes, there are other, there's obviously a whole separate strand that has to do with character and with getting to know someone and getting to inhabit for a moment the way they see the world, or the inside of their mind and their heart, right? And that kind of the feeling of occupying someone else's shoes for a moment is another enormously powerful, pleasurable, exciting thing for an audience to go through.
Have you read Flannery O'Connor?
So long ago that I had a brief period in my life where I read quality fiction, and then that period ended.
Well, I think I started, I don't know, it occurs to me that in some ways there's this interesting parallel maybe between Flannery O'Connor's fiction and your nonfiction in this way. So there's the obvious things, there's the Southern grotesque that's at play, including murder and all sorts of horrific sorts of things occurring. But she at one point said, the novelist with Christian concerns, I'll come back to the Christian concerns in a moment. The novelist with Christian concerns will find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to him, and his problem will be to make these appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural. And I wondered, so is Malcolm like doing a Flannery O'Connor move here, where he may or may not be, being driven by Christian concerns, but some sort of concern where you're wanting people to look at things that seem natural to us and actually see them as gross distortions. So I don't know, thoughts on that?
That's really interesting. I think, what you're talking about is the process by which we awake someone's conscience, right? That's what's describing as the pricking of a conscience. And I do think, like I'm doing this thing, I'm collecting and revising, I'm making a book out of a lot of the things I've been doing on gun violence. And I was telling the story of this case. There's a surgeon, a trauma surgeon in Washington, D.C., named Eddie Cornwell, famous trauma surgeon. And he told me a story of the most interesting case of his career. A young man comes in, been shot 3 times, and he talks about he should have died and doesn't die, right? And one of the purposes of telling that story is, the first thing is to impress upon the audience that in America, we have a category for something called a brilliant trauma surgeon who is expert in treating gunshot wounds. That category does not exist anywhere else in the world. You only become an expert at treating gunshot wounds if you've treated a lot of gunshot wounds. And in no other country in the developed world would any trauma surgeon treat enough gunshot wounds to become an expert. Eddie Cornwell, I asked him, he did his training at LA County Hospital in LA in the 90s during the crack epidemic. Then he goes to East Baltimore, to Hopkins. Then he goes to Howard University in Washington, D.C. He's now in his 60s. I said, in your career, how many gunshot victims have you treated? And he did a little back of the envelope calculation. He said 3,440. This is astonishing. Now, we take that for granted. Like, oh, it's this guy. He's really good at gunshot wounds at Howard, right? Everyone else in the world would say, that's insane. Right. I mean, in Toronto, when I was a kid at the University of Toronto, I had a friend in medical school. They would send medical residents who needed training in seeing gunshot wounds, they'd just send them to Buffalo because there weren't any in Toronto. It's like, so this is a fact about American life. So it goes to this point that we think it is natural, and it's not. It's a distortion.
Yeah.
Right. It's so inexplicably weird and peculiar to the U.S. And we're just blind to it because we've been living with it for so long.
So going back to Flannery O'Connor's quote, for her, the novelist with Christian concerns will then go about trying to make these distortions appear as distortions. What are the concerns that are driving you that make you want to help us see distortions as distortions?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is, I have used this so many times now it's fast becoming the kind of central preoccupation of my storytelling. I talk about it in the Alabama Murders. This line from this Jesuit priest that I love so much, that sin is the failure to bother to care, by which he means, a guy named James Keenan, by which he means that what sin is indifference. It is not malice. I mean, it is malice, but but when we talk about the kind of sin that is typical of our lives, is not based on some kind of flagrant violation of ethical principles. It's indifference. It's just that we don't bother even to see. He was talking about the Good Samaritan, right? About the Pharisees who hurry past the man lying by the side of the road. They're not bad people. They're not like, oh, I'd never help somebody. No, they're moral people who just are in a hurry.
Yeah.
And are like, you know what? I can't really stop right now. I gotta get to work. They're just trying to get to work. Right. And his point is, that's the sin, right? Is like, you can't even muster the energy to kind of care about something. And the world is full of things that we need to care about, we ought to care about, but we can't find the time or the energy to care about them. And I think that's something I keep coming back to again and again and again, because I think much of what ails us is not malice. I do not believe, with some small exceptions, I do not believe I live in a malicious culture. I believe I live in an indifferent culture.
Yeah, I mean, at least, historically in the Christian tradition, I don't know about other religious traditions, but in the Christian tradition, there's this common distinction between so-called sins of omission and sins of commission, right? And he's focusing on sins of omission there, which we tend to focus more on sins of commission, this explicit things we go about doing wrong. But what, why do you think, because I've heard you quote that line quite a few times, why do you think that captured your attention so much?
Because it seemed more, because without that insight, I never knew how to make sense of the fact that there was a lot of suffering and evil in the world, but people are not evil in my experience. Most people. I keep meeting people who are decent and honorable, and yet suffering persists in the world that we live in. So how do you square those? One way to say is to say, I'm mistaken. The people that you think are kind and honorable are actually not. Which seems to me, I don't know. I can't make that jump, and it doesn't seem right to me. I don't think I'm mistaken in that most people. But I think the only way to square that is to say that the reason suffering persists is not because of some kind of active sin of commission, but rather some passive sin of omission, which is that we just can't bring ourselves. After a while, we tune it out. Right.
That reminds me. That prompts me also to ask and remember about Flannery O'Connor. She's working out of that old Augustinian tradition about the fallenness of the world and how deeply riddled the world is with its fallenness. And it does seem to me that while I have certain reticence about that way of thinking about the world, it seems to me a lot of times that talk of things like social injustice or systemic injustice just isn't rigorous enough to get at how screwed up things can be. And that there's something about that theological claim about the brokenness of the world that seems to be true, that kind of seems to be pointing to what you're getting at. So I don't know, do you find, I don't even know what my question is, except maybe to ask, I don't know, do you find a doctrine like that, an idea like that, helpful, constructive in some way, that simply describing something as social injustice just doesn't quite do it for us?
Yeah, it's funny. I guess I am also a little, a little frustrated with that term, because it's describing such a large number of things that have so many different roots. The term social injustice or structural injustice or those kinds of words, I struggle with them because they're too vague for me. I also struggle with the notion that can something be that a huge part of what we can identify as structural injustice, for example, is stuff that most people aren't aware of. Which I think is a really, really crucial point. Like, there's a big difference between the stuff I'm aware of and I turn a blind eye to, and the stuff I didn't even know was a problem. And I think an awful lot of what we identify as structural injustice is stuff that people didn't even know was a problem. That, one of the things that you learn as a journalist is, this is another thing I've said many, many times, is that people are experience rich and theory poor. That most people don't have the luxury to organize the things they see in the world in some kind of coherent form. That's why we require things like teachers, storytellers, journalists, religion. These are all things that add some kind of structure to the things that we're observing. And so once you realize that what most people have is a sort of undifferentiated set of experiences. And they don't have, for honest reasons, don't have the time or the means to organize them. The organizing experience is a huge job. It's really hard, and you need to be a specialist in it. And if I've got 3 kids and a job and I'm struggling to make ends meet, that's something I don't have the luxury to do. I'm not reading like Heidegger at home after I put my kid to bed, right? I'm exhausted. I'm going to sleep, right? So we rely on others to do that for us. And I think a lot of the times when I hear that term, I think, well, I don't fault the public for tolerating structural injustices, because I think in many times the cases they may not even be aware of them. I fault the storytellers, and I fault the lawmakers, and I fault the moral leaders for not bringing it to their attention. That's what I see that as that's my role, and if I'm not doing my job if those kinds of things persist in some sense.
What is it in your own? I'm looking for something further back in your story beyond your James Keenan revelation that sin is a failure to bother to care. And you just now talked about your role is to somehow try to exposit these injustices, these structural failures. Why did that end up capturing you as your role?
I mean, there are many different ways of answering that question. One, professionally, I spent my first 10 years as a journalist at the Washington Post and was surrounded by people who took the craft of journalism very, very seriously in the best possible way. They thought the journalist had a mission, and they understood in the way that Jefferson understood that the a free press was an essential part of a functioning democracy. It didn't work without it, right? It was almost like it was the equivalent of another branch of government. And I saw that in action. That I used to, when I first came to the Post, I sat next to a woman named Kathleen Day, great journalist. She covered banking at a time when there were all kinds of turmoil about how to regulate the banking system. This was the beginnings of the savings and loan crisis, and she was trying to get a handle on what was wrong with the system and explain it to the readers of the Washington Post. And I would listen to her every day, haranguing, calling up like Congress people on the House Banking Committee or regulators, and basically yelling at them and saying, "You've got to tell me, you got to answer this question. You have an obligation to." It was that was my early, I was 20, whatever, 3 years old, 2 years old, sitting next to this great journalist who was holding people's feet to the fire on behalf of the reading public of the United States. And that was really, a very, very powerful formative experience. She wasn't doing this. I mean, she enjoyed her job and she was well paid, but she was in that job for a reason. She had a kind of, and that was so that mattered a lot. And, but I suppose you could go back further. I grew up in a small town, which is full of people who were very civically engaged. That was, my parents and all their friends, they did stuff like this as a matter of course, not, I did a podcast episode once on how my parents and their friends got together and sponsored some Vietnamese refugees after the end of the Vietnam War. And it turned into a kind of lifelong relationship with these, it continues to this day. We still know them, these guys who came over in 1979. But that's there wasn't any discussion. There wasn't a lot of hemming and hawing before my parents and their friends did that kind of stuff. That was the stuff that you did.
Yeah.
Right? You were engaged in the world and you let people know about problems and you tried to solve them.
Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. Do you ever wish you had more folks to discuss the conversations we offer on No Small Endeavor? Something like a podcast listening club where you could engage big ideas about what it means to live life well and then discuss it with friends and companions? If so, you have stumbled upon the announcement you have been waiting for. We're pleased to announce the start of Endeavor Together, our new initiative that equips and nurtures close-knit communities to talk about the things you actually want to talk about. Each small group conversation series is built upon our podcast content and provides you with super easy to use content with questions, videos, links, and guidance so that you or any good and willing soul can host small group conversations exploring what it means to live a good life. Maybe you'll meet in homes around a table, maybe in a coffee shop or local park, maybe at work during lunch hour, maybe in a church Sunday school class. What we are providing is the scaffolding for good conversation. The rest is up to you. And here's the best part. Thanks to generous support from the Lilly Endowment, it's free. The first 2 series have been released. The first, Let's Disagree Better, and the second, Vulnerability. Get started today. Visit nosmallendeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Enjoy. As you worked through as you did the work for the Alabama murders, what were moments at which you just were shocked or taken aback and said, this has to be told and somebody ought to give an account for this?
Well, there are many moments. Before I answer that question, my favorite moment was when your former student, Grant Asbell, invited me to speak to their Wednesday night prayer meeting at Magnolia Church of Christ in Florence, Alabama. That was super fun.
I was down there the Wednesday night following, I think. Yeah.
Yes, you were. But that was, it was very important. I had mentioned earlier that I felt that your influence, in a good way, cast a shadow on that whole thing, which was, it was really, really important to me. We were dealing with a story that began with a Church of Christ minister who had fallen astray of his faith, right? In a very profound way. He betrayed his faith in order to, I think, describe what happened to that man, you had to honor the faith, right? And I was very conscious of the fact that when Yankees come down to Alabama and tell stories about Gothic murders, that's the thing that doesn't happen a lot, right? They sell out. If they were telling a story about a Church of Christ minister who ordered a hit on his wife, what they would do is sell out the Church of Christ. And it was really, 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 really important to me not to do that, to understand that, no, this man, the first victim in this entire story is his church.
Yeah.
Right? And in hanging out with Grant Asbell and going to that church, this is not my church. It's not my culture. It's not my part of the world. But it was an understanding. Did I say to you when I walked into that, I told it to Grant, I think, that, if you are someone who grew up in the church, you know a place where, you can feel the presence of the Lord in a place, right? He felt it in Magnolia Church. It was there, right? And that was the context in which we tell that story, is that we began with, there's a beautiful thing here that was defiled by this man, by this preacher. But you can't understand the defiling unless you understand the beautiful thing.
You're right.
Yeah. That was, so I would start. But there were many other, the villains in the story is the state, is the determination of the state of Alabama to execute these 2 young men in the absence, first of all, of any evidence that they were guilty of the crime that they were supposed to have committed. But secondly, in the absence of any moral reason to do so. And in their indifference to the suffering that they were inflicting on this young man in the course of following out this sentence, it's just no one in the bureaucracy of the Department of Corrections in the state of Alabama seemed to care about what they were doing. That was what was. There's a particular moment where there's a hearing before Kenny Smith, the second of the two defendants, is to be executed. His lawyers are trying to stop the execution from happening. And the state of Alabama had earlier botched Kenny Smith's lethal injection, and now they intend to try a different way of killing him that had never been used before in America, which was to use nitrogen, basically to suffocate him with nitrogen gas. And in this hearing where Kenny's lawyers are trying to stop this from happening, Kenny's attorney asks the director of the Department of Corrections for Alabama whether they had consulted with any medical personnel about what would happen if you tried to kill someone this way. And the guy says, no, we haven't. He said, did you think about or have any conversations about the possible side effects? One of the side effects is that, that in the course of trying to suffocate somebody with nitrogen gas, what often happens is the person vomits. And because they have a gas mask on, they would vomit into the gas mask. And what you would do is you would kill them. They would choke on their vomit. That's how they would die, right? Now, you might say, well, they're going to die anyway. But in this country, if you're going to kill somebody, you have to kill through a method that is, the Supreme Court says, that is considered to be humane. Choking on your own vomit is not on the list of humane practices approved by the Supreme Court of the United States. So the question was given to the state, have you thought about this? And their answer was no. It's like, that was like, we quote the kind of back and forth between the lawyer and the guy from the Department of Corrections, and it's just astonishing. It's just like they don't care. Like, no, we'll kill them whatever way we can kill them. And that was a moment where you just realized the kind of determination of the state to just do away with these people by any means necessary, possible. And that you realize that they had valued the life of these people at zero, right? And that's the thing, that flies in the face of everything I think as a country we stand for. We do not value the lives of anyone at zero, right? Because then we are no better than the worst societies in human history. The whole point of America is everyone is valuable, even those who have committed or have said to have committed horrendous crimes. Which is why, by the way, I mean, we're speaking a day after or 2 days after Trump went on his long rant about Somalians, and correctly, I think many, many, many Americans of all political stripes were horrified by what he said, because he went, that is an example of the very thing that we don't stand for, right? You may legitimately believe there are too many immigrants in this country, or that immigrants cause problems, but we don't believe that immigrants, their lives are worthless. And he touched that. He went so far as to suggest that, and that's the point at which I think all of us say, no, wait a minute.
Yeah. I think when you were maybe working on that part of the story, we swapped an email in which you said something like you were seeing a form of cruelty that seemed new to you or surprising to you in the systems of the Alabama state criminal justice system.
Yeah. It was, even I was surprised. I was surprised by that. I'm used to the bureau, to a bureaucracy that is wedded to a series of sometimes cumbersome, but rules. And it seemed like they no longer had rules, right? They just seemed like they were making it up as they were going along.
So how did this kind of storytelling change you?
The Alabama murders in particular?
Or even other stories you've done, like the Bomber Mafia and so forth.
Well, I think every story that you do changes you in some way. It alerts you to something that you weren't aware of. So that moment you were talking about when I told you that reading that transcript of that court hearing and being aware that they were practicing a kind of cruelty I did not expect. That's a good example of how storytelling changes you. I was also, in a kind of on a more practical note, we did something. I did that Alabama Murders with my colleague Ben Nadaf-Hafrey, and we. It all began because I had sat down with one of the principal characters in the story is a woman named Kate Porterfield, who was a psychologist who comes to work with one of the defendants, Kenny Smith. And I began the whole story by last summer, I just went and sat down with Kate Porterfield and interviewed her over the course of hours. I mean, we probably had 20 hours of tape in the end. I had met with her 5 times. And I began those interviews with a completely open mind. I'd heard she was interesting, and I said, okay, let's just have a conversation. And then similarly, in the 4th session I had with her, she mentioned that she'd been involved in this case in Alabama, and that's how I learned that I wanted to do the story of the Alabama murders. And then when we were starting the story, our first trip to Florence, Alabama, Ben and I just went. We had one interview scheduled, and we just went. And I just said, oh, let's just go down there and poke around. That's not normally how I work. Normally I'm very, very, very well prepared, and I don't go anywhere without having a full slate of things to do. But I entered in the same spirit, which was, let's just go and see what happens. And sure enough, what happens is a guy comes up to me in a coffee shop and says, what are you doing here? And I told him, and he said, you need to meet my friend Grant Asbell. Like, that's how it all begins. Right? And so, like, that sort of changed I'm trying to be much less prescriptive in my reporting, or not, that's the wrong word. I'm trying to be much more open, and I think the story was way richer as a result of that we uncovered all kinds of. There was another moment in the story where we go to see some guy who was a member of the minister's church, and we thought he would be able to tell us all about. He was also a police officer. We thought he could tell us all about the case, and we get to his house, and we're chatting with him, and then 10 minutes in, he says, actually, I can't tell you much. I didn't know much. But then he says, but my friend Ricky does. And then he calls Ricky right on the phone, right over there. Ricky, two guys here want to come talk to you. They're Yankees, but they're all right. And so we went and we saw Ricky, and Ricky knew everything. Like, so there was a lot of that. And, it's so learning to have a little more faith in serendipity is something that I'm, even at my advanced stage, I'm starting to learn and respect more.
So, what are other things that you learned about regional differences? I mean, you're the Yankee. You're technically not a Yankee because you're a Canadian, but you're the Yankee that's gone down to Alabama. What do you see about regional differences that stood out to you from this experience?
Asks Lee Camp, native of Alabama.
Yeah, I'm listening.
Let's bring back that accent. By the way, the number one thing is the accents are so fantastic. I had not appreciated the extent to which an Alabama accent is quite distinct from other Southern accents. Yeah. When Yankees do the Southern accent, they do something that it's really Texas they're doing.
I don't know what it is, but it's offensive.
But I think people lapse into Texas, and they're not. And Alabama's not
No.
Texas. It's a
No, it's very
long
different.
way
It's
from
a very
Texas.
different accent. Yeah.
And the other thing, I actually, I should say, and you know this about me, and this is a totally non-condescending thing. I happen to love Alabama. I have done so many stories from Alabama. I am genuinely fascinated by the state. I think it is, and I can never, the thing that I learned about in this time round is that I've done stuff before in Birmingham and in Montgomery, and I've never done Northwestern Alabama. And I didn't appreciate that it's Appalachia. And it's not this, it's not the Mississippi Delta,
Right, yeah.
or it's not like, it's not a steel town like Birmingham. So I didn't, but the diversity of Alabama is astonishing. I mean, it's one of these, it's these North-South states are always going to be more interesting than East-West states, right? And it is really a North-South state. I mean, the North is a different,
Right. Yeah.
it's like Florida, like, that great line about Florida. The further north you go in Florida, the more south. Wait, the further north you go in Florida, the more south you get, or something. I've forgotten. It's because Jacksonville is south, and Miami is
not
Latin
right.
America.
Yeah, that's right.
Not, the south ends in
Yeah,
Jacksonville.
right.
It's like you have to go to Jacksonville. But no, so that was, it's sort of, but it deepened my, it's just an interesting, I don't know. I'm drawn to, not in a kind of, like I say, not in a kind of, I'm not gaping, I hope, at the kind of Gothic elements the way that people often do. I find it genuinely, I mean, it's a state that gave us, in my book, David and Goliath, I had a long thing about the civil rights movement in Birmingham and Montgomery, particularly Birmingham. The Birmingham marches, a kind of central. It's the story. And I've often talked about, one of my favorite books is "Carry Me Home," that book by Diane McWhorter, which I think is the best book written about the civil rights movement. And it's all about Birmingham, and it makes you fall in love with Birmingham, as well as you appreciating Birmingham for all of its understanding its many shortcomings.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in another exchange you and I had during the time you were working on this, I expressed that I think that one of the things that's frustrating as a Southerner is so often there's this sense that there's a condescension towards the South, as if we are unaware of our grave historic failings. And while the Apostle Paul has that famous line about, when you judge another, you thereby have judged yourself. And it's kind of like, as I grew older, I more and more realized the horrific failures of Alabama and the South, and things that I was blind to as a boy, because I was a white boy of a middle class family, and couldn't see a lot of the stuff that was happening all around me, or that had happened right around me. And one of the stories that I've told multiple times to folks is that I didn't know that one of the interstate buses during the Civil Rights Movement was firebombed 20 minutes from my house. I never knew that growing up in Alabama. And it was not until I moved and was in seminary till I learned that story. So I know that there were all sorts of things that I was blind to, and so much of my adult life has been understanding better who I am by recovering and hearing and studying those stories and all of those movements and all of this beauty and bravery. And so it's kind of like, none of us like, I think, to be pointed at or mocked without realizing, oh, wait a second, we're not the only ones that have even these problems or lots of problems, right? It's kind of like we've all got plenty of problems and failures and horrors. But I think that's one of the things that you did so well in this, was that it didn't come across as that sort of condescension. It didn't come across as that sort of judgment, even though, by the end, I was exasperated and furious with my own home state again. And so I appreciate that you seem to try to find that balance of where you're trying to tell a story that's going to lead the listener to anger, or hopefully a righteous anger, while not being a form of condescension driven by regional difference. Yeah.
We beat up in revisionist history and in my own writing, we beat up on the North all the time. I mean, that story I told you about, Eddie Cornwall, like Baltimore and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. It's like, we're not talking about Mississippi here. We're talking about home, places that are down the road from me.
Yeah. So the writer, historian, activist Rebecca Solnit, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce her last name.
Oh, yeah.
She said at one point, "We think we tell stories, but stories often tell us," which I find to be a fascinating contention. And I think in some ways, some of the things you've already said kind of exhibit that, illustrate that. But let me use that as a way to jump into a critique that I've heard in several different kind of ways of this season of revisionist history of the Alabama murders. One reviewer said something like, "What's absent," I'm quoting here, "what's absent from the narrative this season, however, is an equal emotional dedication to the importance of the victim's life. The murdered woman is glossed over. Gladwell seems to believe that these men's suffering is world-changing. The woman's suffering is merely expository. Ironically, this attitude mirrors the misogynistic world of the Christian church that cultivated the environment that led to her murder." What do you do with that?
Well, I would say two things. One is, we do have, at length, we have an interview with the victim's, one of her friends, talking at length about her marriage. And that was a very deliberate choice. We were trying to bring her to life. The problem, it's sort of a storytelling problem, which is that, she's gone by, the story opens with her leaving the scene, right? So she's not around to give any accounts. Her husband's dead. Her kids don't want to talk. We ran into her cousin when we were in Alabama, but he didn't want to, not even her cousin, her half-brother. And he didn't want to talk on the record. I mean, there's a sensitivity around, if you think about any kind of story, particularly a story that involves a crime, there are these particular sensitivities that you have to respect. And some people who are engaged in these dramas these narratives don't want any part of it, and you have to respect that. And if someone doesn't want to be part of it, there's nothing you can do. I can't do a whole episode about someone without people speaking on their behalf, right? So there's a storytelling problem that emerges here. It's sort of unfortunate, and we were acutely aware of the fact that she vanishes from the narrative. And after we have that thing with her friend talking about how she was beaten by her husband and neglected by him, and there's a whole other thing which, I'm not going to get into, but we learned all kinds of other things about that marriage that we couldn't use, didn't want to use. Their children are still alive, right? You have to kind of respect their lives as well. So the story is naturally going to gravitate towards those who are willing to participate. And that is always a kind of unfortunate fact about journalism. If I was writing a novel about this, I could rectify that situation. I could imagine myself, and I wouldn't have to worry about the feelings and sensitivities of the family because the family would be fictional. But in this case, the family's real, and they're still alive, and that conditions the way I can discuss particularly the mom.
I think you said there were two things to say about that. Was that just the first one, or was there another thing you?
Oh, the first one was we did our best, and we tracked down the friend, but the second was just they were all these kind of structural limitations.
Yeah. What sort of feedback have you? Well, let me back up on that question. You indicated that you have heard from a lot of folks in the various faith communities about the critique that you're explicitly making about the death penalty, and that you had been fascinated by that. Any other commentary on that?
Yeah, I don't know whether what I mostly, if I look through the sort of emails that kind of come in, unsolicited emails from listeners, most of them are people who are, they're mostly interested in the descriptions of the Church of Christ. They're either current or past, either people who grew up in the church, or still in the church and left, or who are still in the church, and they were fascinating. They were very interested in the kind of portrayal of the church in some of the opening episodes.
Did they find that portrayal fair or unfair?
They were, I'm getting a sample of people who wanted to write me, so they're going to say it was fair. I don't think you tend not to hear from the people who were. I heard a couple of people say that they expected it to be unfair and were surprised to hear that it was fair. I got a lovely email from one of the attorneys, Kenny Smith's attorneys, the one who cross-examined the head of the Alabama Department of Corrections. I had spoken to Kenny's other attorney, but not this guy, and he sent me a really lovely note about what the case had meant to him and how grateful he was that we'd taken the time to talk about it. But it's very hard, when you do any kind of writing like this, you don't get any kind of systematic feedback. So you're getting a sample and a sample. Online, you get a sample of people who are angry. And in emails, you get a sample of people who are happy. And so you don't really get a good sense of what the actual reaction was.
I interrupted you when you were about to talk about people's thinking about the death penalty.
Oh, well, it's so death penalty. I think of as excuse me. One of I despair of ever changing anyone's mind on it. I don't think this series, even if it was the most powerful series ever done on the death penalty, is going to change anyone's mind. I think this is one of those things where what you're doing is you're giving people who are opposed to it additional reasons to be opposed to it. And people who are indifferent, maybe some reason to care, you're not changing the mind of someone who's already in favor of it. Particularly making the point that the administration of justice in the case of the death penalty in a place like Alabama is cruel, actually serves in some way to buttress pro-death penalty people, because for many of them, the cruelty is the point. In fact, at the time when lethal injection was invented in the mid-'70s, the principal objection, and it was supposed to supplant the electric chair, the principal objection to the implementation of lethal injection was that it was not cruel enough. The idea was, how can we deter people from killing each other if the ultimate penalty, is a walk in the park? It's just a pleasant going to sleep. No, it's got to be, you got to fry the brains out if this is going to be a deterrent. So there's this strain in American thinking about the death penalty that welcomes any evidence that this is a miserable experience for the convicted prisoner. So to the extent that we devoted 2.5 episodes to describing how miserable the experience was, all we're doing is strengthening the conviction of those who are in favor of the death penalty. Right? It's one of the ironies of sometimes when you think you can never, as a storyteller, control how the story you're telling is going to be received by your audience. That's rule number one. And so some part of me regrets that this story will strengthen the conviction of pro-death penalty people.
I don't have any doubt that it will strengthen the convictions of some pro-death penalty proponents. However, I mean, as you were saying, that you don't think it changes anybody's minds. I mean, I think that one of the things that, as you and I have gotten to know each other the last couple of years, I think one of the things that I've been fascinated by with me as an academic who does ethics and theological ethics, you know, our primary way of trying to change people's minds is through the lecture, and is through intellectual engagement with ideas. And occasionally that changes people's minds. But I don't know. I tend to think that storytelling is a much more poignant, powerful way of changing people's minds, because one of the things it does is it changes what people see. And then they can begin to see something that they didn't see otherwise. And as you were saying that, I thought about a text message I got from a friend of mine who grew up in Alabama. We grew up in the same church. We know all this stuff. And as a matter of fact, the reason I sent her the series was because I knew that she would find interesting the conversation about our shared church experiences growing up. And but what I got back from her was, and she speaks in very pious terms. And, you know, and what she was saying was, I'm sitting here praying, asking for forgiveness from God that I have never taken seriously the death penalty and the problems with the death penalty. And I find myself convicted and repenting of my failure to take seriously this practice in our state. And so I don't know. I think that I think the storytelling might have a bit more power at changing people's minds than you're giving it there.
Yeah. Yeah. What a lovely thing to. By the way, the language. That's what that language is for, right? Like there's a real beauty in her, the way you describe her, using these Christian terms of art to describe what she was going through, and it's both beautiful and it's explicit.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know. I love that kind of the use of language in that way.
Well, I don't want to reduce your storytelling to moral propositions or any sort of moralistic agenda, but that said, I do want to ask you here as we close, you know, after telling this kind of story, what are some of the things that you wish had been done? And maybe point to across the spectrum. What if you could have rewritten the story so that different players did things differently, what might some of those be?
Well, there's a moment, we don't use it, but there's a moment when there's a press conference after Kenny Smith's execution, and the family of the victim and I believe the Attorney General of the state of Alabama are speaking about the execution. And the Attorney General says, I just want you to know that I've spoken with the family, and they have forgiven Kenny Smith. And, blah, blah, blah. He finishes off. I forgot what he says next. But, and I didn't get into that because I didn't want to kind of dwell on the family, as I said earlier. But to my mind, that's not forgiveness. You can't simultaneously advocate for the execution of someone and say that you forgive them for their sin. To my mind, forgiveness has to have an action. You have to say, I forgive them and I don't think they should be executed. And I wish, if I could change one thing, it would simply be, I wish that a real definition of forgiveness had been in operation, in evidence in that story. All along the way, there was no forgiveness ever. No one at every point in that story, everyone was incapable of, of appreciating the moral circumstances of the people who were engaged in any of these actions. Nobody got forgiven, right? And that's what I wish had happened. That there was, this. I grew up in and around a Christian tradition, the Mennonites, for whom real forgiveness is a very, 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 very serious thing. It's at the core of what they believe. And I did this whole interview, which we did not use. We may use in the audiobook version. There was a story of the same year that this murder took place, there was another pastor murdered in Florida, Mennonite pastor, by a kind of drug addict who was in this neighborhood. And the murderer was, same scenario, was convicted of the crime, was put up for the death penalty, and the daughter of the man who was murdered, who was also severely injured in the attack, publicly forgave her father's murderer and said that he should not be executed, asked that his life be saved. And it's this parallel story of, and instead of wallowing, instead of the anger and the bitterness persisting over the next generation, the opposite happened, that she found some peace, and has become an advocate against the death penalty, a powerful one around the United States. She found meaning and peace in her father's murder because she chose to forgive his assailant. And I wish that is the thing that did not happen in the case of Kenny Smith and John Forrest Parker. The suffering just got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And it is because nobody ever understood what forgiveness was.
Talking to Malcolm Gladwell on his latest season of the Revisionist History podcast entitled The Alabama Murders. Thank you, Malcolm. Great to be with you.
Thank you, Lee. This was fun.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.